For joining us. My name is Alex Varela. I am a trust attorney, and I'm so happy to be here this afternoon with all of you doing a presentation with Leanne. Leanne is the owner and a professional fiduciary at Hitchman Fiduciaries. She does incredible work. She is so knowledgeable about many different topics, but especially the one that we're going to be covering today, which is special needs trust. So Leanne, thank you so much for being with me today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And today, really, this is just going to be a conversation about what special needs trusts are, and more importantly, things that need to be thought about, talked about when we discuss special needs trust. I have had the privilege to work with the most amazing, resilient people who are fierce advocates for their children, just incredible parents who have so much to think about when it comes to estate planning and planning for special needs children and beneficiaries. And so I'm really excited to do this with Leanne, just talk about some of these topics and hopefully help people. Well, today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about special needs trust. Some folks also refer to them as supplemental needs trusts because obviously we're trying to supplement the needs of the beneficiaries for things that are not provided for by government benefits. And before we jump in, I think we should start with, okay, what is a special needs trust? So a special needs trust is a special type of trust designed to set aside money and property for the benefit of the beneficiary whose disability may not allow them to work and they're receiving public assistance for medical and other expenses. So it's designed to provide for them, again, anything that government benefits are not providing for, to protect them, and then replaces traditional beneficiary planning. I think it's also important to note that there are two types of special needs trust: third party and first party special needs trust. So what we are covering today is third party special needs trust. So that special needs trust that you set up for someone else, like a child, a niece or a nephew, a grandchild that has a disability and is on public benefits or is receiving public benefits. A first party special needs trust is a special needs trust that as someone with a disability will set up for themselves. And so those rules and the way that those are drafted are completely different. Today, the focus is third-party special needs trust and what we need to think about with respect to doing that type of planning. Special needs trust for those who have disabilities are necessary, very, very important because people with disabilities live longer. There's no guarantee. Obviously, we want to protect any benefits, Medi-Cal, Social Security, whatever it is that they're receiving. But we don't know if those government benefits are going to be around forever. And we're typically talking about beneficiaries who can't just go out and get a job. So as their parent or their grandchild, obviously you want to make sure that they're protected. And again, not only do we not know if the government benefits will be around, but we won't know if the government benefits are going to meet their needs forever. And that's why we want to make sure that we have the proper planning in place to be able to provide for them. For those who don't know, Leanne, because this is definitely an area where you know and have more knowledge than I, but for those that don't know, what type of benefits may a person with disabilities be receiving?
Sure. So typically what we see is some form of Social Security. And usually while the parent is alive, and no, I'm going to assume that this is a child of a parent, while the parent is here and not retired and not receiving Social Security themselves, usually that's in the form of something called SSI. SSI is means tested, meaning that the income is measured. If the person is at the poverty line, they receive this. Now, sometimes I talk to parents and they say, but my 30-year-old son lives with me. He My income is going to keep him from qualifying for SSI. And that's really not true, because over the age of 18, your son is seen as his own household. So just make sure you're not deducting him as a dependent on your taxes, and then he should be eligible for that full SSI amount. Once somebody retires, and this is the thing I see so often overlooked, once the parent retires, assuming that the child is qualified as something called a disabled adult child, and that is typically referring to a developmental disability that occurs before age 18. Then that child, rather than being on SSI, usually is eligible for 50% of the parent's retired income. And that's a big deal because that's no longer means tested. That is an absolute. Doesn't matter if the child has other money, all those kinds of things. That is something that you as the parent have earned by paying into Social Security. And that's the safety net that's appropriate. So anybody out there that falls into that category, I beseech you to double check your child is receiving disabled adult child if you're retired, if that he or she qualifies for that. Um, the last thing that somebody could be receiving is something called disability income. And that would be if your child worked and paid sufficient amount into the Social Security system and
Mhm.
then became disabled. Then they might be receiving something called SSDI. That's not means tested. They've earned that because they paid into the system. And
Mhm.
so that has a different level of protection associated with it. And then last but not least, sorry, Alex, it was a long question you
No,
asked.
that's okay.
Last but not least is Medi-Cal or Medicaid if you're out of California. And so Medi-Cal is there to pay the medical benefits. And even if you do not use Medi-Cal for the medical, like for example, maybe you pay for a private medical insurance policy for your child, Medi-Cal eligibility is still really critical because there may become a time when it is utilized. For example, it does pay if your child becomes eligible for Medicare, Medi-Cal eligibility will pay for that Medicare premium. Or if your child has severe disabilities to the point where they need and qualify for some sort of in-home support services, that is linked to Medi-Cal. So I sometimes find parents thinking, oh, I don't care about the Medi-Cal, but please don't do that because even though you might not be utilizing it for medical resources like doctors, you may want to use it for something else. So those are the big ones, the four big benefits that your child or grandchild might be receiving if indeed they're classified in the eyes of Social Security as disabled or a person with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in working with clients over the years, the regional center is also an incredible
Yeah.
resource for people. So for folks that are watching that maybe their child just got diagnosed or something like that, they're trying to learn more about this whole area. What is the regional center and how does it help
Mhm.
folks?
So Regional Center is in California only. It is one of our bigger, it's certainly probably about the biggest benefit with the developmentally delayed, cognitively impaired community for those that were either born with cognition deficits or
Mhm.
became cognitively disabled before the age of 18. I sometimes hear parents kind of, I'll be blunt, disparaging regional center. And the reason is because they have a minor child and that minor child is in the school system. So while that's happening, regional center is not going to play as big of a role. But oh my gosh, if I could only give you a glimpse into what happens in the older years. So, for
Mhm.
example, regional center might pay for a group home. They will pay for work programs. They'll pay for day programs. There may be some sort of special counseling that we've availed. Regional center of those services. One of my favorites is for adult children that are on the spectrum. Sometimes there's behavior issues. Probably one of the best way to get behavioral psychologists, true experts in that field, is through regional center because they have for years funded those people with those kinds of talents. And those are really
Mhm.
very, very specific niche specialists. So I beseech you guys, don't give up on regional center because you're thinking, well, they don't do anything for my child. It is a safety net insurance policy for that child as they get older and as they age.
Awesome. Thank you so much. With special needs trust, a special needs trust has to be drafted in a very specific way. It has to include language to avoid the trust being considered a countable resource. And they can be drafted as testamentary or an embedded special needs trust or a standalone special needs trust. And with an embedded special needs trust, the provisions of the family trust, like for example, my husband and I's trust is going to say for this child, distribute it this way as a supplemental or a special needs trust. But it's all going to be, all of the provisions are going to be in the family trust. Sometimes we draft a standalone special needs trust where it's its own binder, if you will, it's its own trust. And my husband Steve and I's trust might say, for this child, distribute it according to the blah, blah, blah special needs trust, the name of that child. And so this is something that we talk with clients about and explain the pros and the cons. But I was curious, Leanne, if you have an opinion on what's better, what's easier to administer from your perspective when you're working with families, when we actually
Yeah.
need the trust.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you do that for your clients, because I find when I speak to people in general, they are only thinking of the embedded trust. So the first thing that I want to look at is there a possibility of money, finances coming from sources other than the family trust or the parents?
Mhm.
So it could be grandparents, aunts and uncles, et cetera. And that way, if you have a standalone trust, you can utilize that. Whereas if it's an embedded trust, we have to wait for the settlers of the family trust to die. And so that might not be reasonable. I can give you a really good example. My daughter Annalise that I work with is her one of my son, her brother, just had a new baby who's profoundly disabled. She has a genetic mutation. And what Annalise is doing is setting up a standalone special needs trust for her with the idea that all of us can contribute small amounts over time, not a big deal, and then do it that way. And then if the grandparents want to contribute upon their death, it'll be all ready for them to go.
Mhm.
And we have a fairly large family, so it makes sense that, we're looking to do that. But other people may say, well, I only have, it's only the parents that are going to fund it. And that's fine. Then go ahead and do that embedded special needs trust. I personally have never had an issue with it. It's a little awkward when I have to show it to Social Security because they'll probably ask to see parts of the family trust, but
Mhm.
so what? It's okay. I don't know
Mhm.
that it necessarily justifies an entire standalone trust.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering that. With a special needs trust, and I think just in the life of providing for a child with disabilities, it sometimes takes a village, right, or a team,
Mm,
and that
right.
is definitely built into the trust. So a special needs trust can create or allow for an advisory committee, a care manager. Obviously, we're going to talk about what the trustee is, and it will almost always include a statement of intent, right? This is because I want
Mhm.
my child to live as independently as possible, or whatever that intent is. Will almost always include that. But tell us a little bit about the different roles, Leanne. What is a
Sure.
care manager? Well, we'll start with an advisory committee. That would make the most
Mhm.
sense. What is an advisory committee, and how does that play into a special needs trust?
Yeah, so an advisory committee is there not necessarily to make specific day-to-day decisions, but to give input into for the trustee. Because as trustees, sometimes we kind of sit back and we wonder what's the best decision to make? What would the
Mhm,
parents do? How do we
mhm,
how do we evaluate that? So that could be as an advisory committee, it could also be as a trust protector. And the trust itself defines what powers that committee has. And so the only suggestion I have is sometimes I meet parents that have this idea that the advisory committee should or the trust protector should approve every single disbursement from the trust. And I can tell you guys that just doesn't work. It'll cause delay, it might cause argument if there's more than one person on the committee, so on and so forth. In the meantime, we have the poor beneficiary needing whatever. There used to be kind of a famous example of that. It's probably still out there of beneficiary request tickets to Disneyland, and the trust mandated the advisory committees or the trust protectors' approval of that. And that person was overseas doing on vacation or something, and by the time the approval could be received, the Disneyland trip had already passed. So that, I mean,
Mhm.
talk about disappointment. It's just the saddest story ever. So just
Right.
try to get, it is important to choose the right trustee that you can trust a certain level of discretionary authority. I mean, clearly a Disneyland trip probably should have been paid for in that case, unless there was some mitigating circumstance. I think what the advisory committee trust protector is there to do is to make sure the spirit of things is being followed. And by that, I mean something like overspending should be watched, underspending should be watched too, because if
Mhm.
your trustee isn't doing anything, that's a problem.
Mhm.
That money is there to be used. So um, I like advisory committees, trust protectors. There's a lot of people that would disagree with me, but I feel like there's a more transparency when I have it, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then how about a care manager? What does a care manager do?
So yeah, so care manager is there to as a they're usually either a social worker or a nurse,
Mhm.
and they're there to help ascertain what the needs of the beneficiary are. In our practice, we do one of two things on occasion. We don't have a care manager for every single trust because it's an added expense and it may not make
Mhm.
sense. They may not be
Mhm.
needed. But sometimes we'll have a situation, like I have one right now where their beneficiary is asking, or the guardian is asking for a pool, and the beneficiary has a trach, and that really scares me for obvious reasons. He could drown.
Mhm.
And so as trustee, I've requested an evaluation by a care manager for that, so that I'm not just making the decision, because frankly, my knee-jerk reaction was to say no, not because I want to be mean, but
Mhm.
because it concerns me, the liability,
Mhm.
and the risk to that person. So a care manager can go out, make those kinds of suggestions, evaluations, and so on. Um, as far as naming one, I wouldn't recommend naming a specific one, because by the time this happens, usually they work, they don't have firms. It's usually just their sole practitioners. A good chance
Mhm.
that they may not be there. And if you name it in the trust, then what do we do? Because we can't get
Mhm.
them. Um, we're kind of unusual in our practice. So I'm a certified care manager. I have a nurse on staff who's a care manager. That's not typical of most trustees, but we do it because we do so much special needs trust work. And just in the course of our regular trust administration, we found circumstances that I felt warranted an investigation by a care manager. Usually it was neglect. Parents are gone, no, maybe most of the family is gone, and the person is in some sort of circumstance that didn't smell right. And
Mhm.
so in that case, either I would hire a care manager, or particularly in those cases where maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm imagining it. Usually we'll go
Mhm.
out and do it ourselves and make an unannounced visit and just see what's going on. Not that we're trying to be intrusive and violate some civil rights, but it is my duty as trustee, if I'm making payments, I need to know that that person is safe, that those whatever it is that trust is purchasing, it's actually being used by the beneficiary. So I had one example where the beneficiary kept asking for a ton of toilet paper and paper towels and just general
Mhm.
supplies, and it just didn't feel right. Like, how could one
Mhm.
person, like, it's okay if you want the nice one that's soft, but this is ridiculous. Paid an unannounced visit, and our care manager caught one, an unlicensed group home that Regional Center wasn't aware of, so we made them aware. And secondly, that they were trying to get the beneficiary to buy all the supplies for everybody in the home. So
Wow. Wow.
I know. And I don't want to say that to scare everybody. What I want you to realize is that if you do the right planning and put the right people in place, that they're going to sniff that kind of thing out, because that's your hard-earned money that's being spent on the beneficiary, and you really need somebody who's going to advocate and I don't know, just advocate and take a stance if something doesn't feel right. So that could be a care manager, it could be the trustee.
Yeah, and that leads us to the next role, the trustee, which in my opinion is the most important role and the one where I spend the most amount of time talking to
Mm.
clients, because many clients ask me like, well, can I name my sister? Could I name
Yeah.
the older brother? And what does it entail? And I don't want to discourage them, but I also want to be realistic with them about what the administration of a special needs trust involves and some of the
Mhm.
reasons why it could be helpful to name a professional. So
Mm.
just, I know there's a lot that we can talk about with this one question I'm about to
No.
ask you, but what does a trustee do on for administration of a special needs trust? What does that involve? Just tell
Mhm.
us about the role.
Yeah, so whether it's a family member or a professional trustee, and I'm going to back up 2 seconds. So in California, people like myself that are licensed as professional trustees, we go through some training, we have to pass a test, we have to renew our license every year, kind of like an attorney would have to do.
Mhm, mhm,
So similar to that, we take certain continuing education requirements. The job per se of trust administration is the same regardless of whether it's a professional or a family member. And I think sometimes family members think that they're going to get cut a break because, well, I'm just a family member. I didn't know any better. And it
right.
just doesn't work that way. If you are held to the same duty, you could be sued, you could be criticized, you could be removed, all those kinds of things. So I'm not trying to get business for myself, but I do think in all fairness, family members should realize that, I mean, they're kind of in the hot seat. If they make a disbursement from the trust that triggers loss of public benefits, that's a huge problem for the beneficiary. And somebody could come after the trustee. I mean, the beneficiary could hire an attorney and say, my sibling caused me to lose my SSI and now I don't have that money to live on. So just realize that it does come with a lot of responsibilities. And you can't just say, I didn't know any better. It just doesn't work. But I think for the most part, families want to do a really quality job too. And so that means that they have to educate themselves on how to do this. They need to know about public benefits rules and they need to have some idea of like, could this benefit or could whatever it is that's being asked for, could somebody else provide it? Because the special needs trust should be the payer of last resort.
Mhm,
So it means learning about these kinds of things. What do I do all the time? So a big part of our practice is special needs trust. Not all, but it's significant. And personally, that's where every day on my desk, that's what I do. It's where my passion is. So I spent a lot of time training, giving talks, writing articles, keeping abreast of the newer things. If you're considering a private fiduciary, really grill them hard as to what their expertise is in special needs trust, because many of them will say, yeah, I do that, but it's probably not their mainstream business. And for me, that's a problem. I mean, they need to be
mhm.
immersed in it so they know what they're doing every day.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree. And then we talked about a lot of these questions that I have here with regards to what is a
Hmm.
care manager, what do these people do, why are there so many roles, but why is it important for everyone to work well together? We talked a little bit about care managers. Is it typical
Hmm.
for the trustee to select the care manager? How does that work? Yeah. So anything else that you want to add about the
So I think
roles?
it depends. Sometimes the family will want a care manager involved and they have somebody specific, and I would say great. But sometimes the trustee is faced with a decision and the trustee doesn't have sufficient information or knowledge to be able to make that decision. Like me with my trach example. So I as trustee went off and selected a care manager that I knew could answer that question. Now, it was still the beneficiary could refuse, and that's okay. But also as trustee, I don't just write checks. I don't just say, sure, whatever you want, you'll get. And so if the beneficiary refused on something that serious, I would say, I'm so sorry, but I cannot provide this pool
Mhm,
until I have a proper evaluation and I know that you're safe.
mhm,
And that's it. I mean, that is a trustee's job. It is, you got to be able to say no.
mhm,
And that's probably also what's really hard for family members is they don't want to say no to their niece or their sibling or whatever because you want to be able to say yes. You want to
mhm,
make that person happy. But let's say the expenditure is kind of a luxury and the um the trust funds are somewhat limited. The trustee needs to say no because our job, I always have this minimum standard. My job is to make sure there's a roof over the person's head and food in their belly. I mean, that is my bare minimum. So if somebody's asking for a car and there isn't enough money to last the lifetime, I'm going to say no, probably, unless they can demonstrate to me that they have alternative means of support and that this isn't going to cause harm for them.
Yeah, and that's a perfect transition into our next topic, which is funding the special needs trust. And this is something else that I spend a lot of time
Yeah.
talking to clients with. And how do we project how much money, he or she, Sally's going to need? Obviously, life insurance ends up being a really good tool.
Mhm.
And then there's the whole topic of retirement accounts and who we name the beneficiary and how those retirement accounts are paid out and the taxes. And there's so much that goes into this. But when you're working with parents and talking specifically about the funding and about the budgeting, what do you have to say about that? Because I know before this call, we talked about that and about the budgeting and how important that is. And you gave me a whole new perspective because I hadn't thought about it at some of the things that you said. So if you'll share that with us.
Sure. So I think the first problem is there's almost never enough money. And the second problem is that the parents don't know how much money is going to be left in their estate because
Hmm.
they themselves are using the money for their own care, perhaps as they get older.
Hmm.
So that's just the realities. There's almost never enough money. So we have to work within that context, I think. And we can try to project as best we can, but I'm kind of a realist. And if somebody lives to be 98 years old, there may not be as much money as if they pass at age 75. I mean, that's
Hmm.
just how it is. So we do our best. We might have multiple scenarios. Life insurance is a great way to help guarantee that amount, if you will.
Hmm.
And then on the retirement accounts, one of the things I like to make sure everybody knows is that the CARES Act, one of the neat things it did in this particular area is if somebody's on public benefits and therefore can evidence that they are a person with disabilities, they don't fall under that 10-year rule. So right
Hmm.
now, if you inherit an IRA, you have to exhaust it in 10 years for most of us. If you're a person with disabilities, it actually that time period goes over your lifetime. So that's pretty attractive stuff. It used to be, I think, that everyone was saying, well, just don't give the special needs beneficiary the retirement accounts. But I'm kind of thinking the opposite. Maybe give that to them because they're going to be in a lower tax bracket than the other beneficiaries
For sure.
and they can stretch it over a longer period of time. So
Yeah,
don't give up on that.
yeah, admittedly, before the Secure Act, I think I felt that way, that maybe it wasn't
Mhm.
a good idea to give special needs beneficiaries retirement
Yeah,
accounts. But now it's like, actually, no, they benefit. Less goes to the IRS and more goes to your
right.
family. So it actually makes
Exactly.
a lot more sense. And these are some other questions that I thought of with relationship to funding special needs trust. But one that I know we've talked about is ABLE accounts. So what's your feeling
Mhm.
on ABLE accounts? What are they? If someone watching this presentation has no idea what they are, and what are some things that they need to think about with respect to ABLE accounts?
Sure. So ABLE is a better life. I don't know what the E is, a better life something. And that was very much what the intent was, is how can we, I mean, come on, guys, let's face it, the public benefits amounts are so low, it's almost embarrassing. Nobody can
Right.
live on that.
Yeah.
And so the idea was is for the legislatures, how could we make it better for individuals that are living on public benefits that are means tested? And that was how the ABLE accounts came about, is it's a way of accumulating money. So let me give you just a icky example. Let's say a beneficiary was trying to save some money to buy a used car, and that used car was about $5,000. I mean, that's really a value that I think we should be supporting, that was happening. But with that beneficiary received SSI, he could not exceed a bank account of $2,000. And so he was penalized even with this, laudable objective, he couldn't do it. And so an ABLE account is a way to be able to accumulate funds over $2,000. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's a lot of little tricks that you can do with ABLE accounts that help reduce any kind of penalty against public benefits. If anybody wants to go to my website, there's some blog articles about it. But like for example, paying rent from an ABLE account can be a really attractive way. Although Social Security finally just is changing the rules on rent payment.
Mm,
But anyway, there's some articles there. Um, some of the drawbacks, though, able accounts aren't perfect. And so they go in the name of the beneficiary,
mhm,
or possibly an advocate can open them. But in general, the beneficiary has control of that account. And for me, from a practical perspective in my practice, a lot of the people I work with have difficulties, challenges controlling impulse control.
mm,
So I always am very cautious about putting money into an ABLE account. So as a trustee of a special needs trust, one of my favorite tools is to be able to put money, deposit money into an ABLE account. It becomes that beneficiary's money, and they can take it as cash. They can do whatever they want to. It gives them a level of privacy that the trustee isn't asking for receipts or bothering them and so
mhm.
on. So I really like it. But the bad thing, that's the flip side, is if I do that, I got to think about how I'm doing it. So let's say I have a specific use for the payment of funds in the ABLE account. I'm probably going to evaluate or test the beneficiary to make sure that they don't run out of the money. Um, like, let's
Mhm.
say I want to get them cash to buy food. You know, they want to go to Carl's Jr. and McDonald's and whatever, fast food. Well, I can't just give them cash from the Special Needs Trust, but I can put money into the ABLE account. But technically, I could do a one time annual distribution of $18,000. Might not be a good idea though, because once the $18,000 is gone, I can't put any more in.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to need a beneficiary, or I'm going to need to know how good is that beneficiary at budgeting and controlling the expenses. So when I want to use an ABLE account, sometimes I do it annually. I make that distribution. Other times I do it monthly. Others, again, I do it weekly. I've had some when I've done it multiple times a week because they just kept running out of money and
Mm.
they weren't able to handle it. So that's that's the drawback of ABLE accounts, is you really have to take into consideration what can that beneficiary handle. But the positive is it gives them autonomy. They don't have to report receipts. They don't have to tell Social Security what they're doing. It's really, really positive stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And to that, and I'm sorry, the name escapes me, but I feel like in talking to parents and the like, I've heard of a card, right? There's some sort
Mhm.
of
There's
card
a
as well.
TrueLink card attached to it. Yes, there
Okay.
is.
Yes.
Yes.
And how
So
does that work?
CalAble in California gives them a card, and they can use that to, I guess, debit maybe is the right word, to debit actually, I think they have to transfer. It's almost like a prepaid card. So they transfer from the CalAble onto the card, and then they use it, I think, are the steps.
I see. Okay. Wonderful.
And it
Um,
really works. I mean, it's worth doing for sure.
yes, absolutely. So the key benefits to our clients when they're using special needs trust for their children, their loved ones, is that they don't have to consider disinheriting special needs individuals, because I
Yeah.
can't even remember how many times I've had that conversation
Oh,
where,
always,
oh,
always. I
always.
mean,
And I
yes.
will be honest, I have done that. When clients really, really insist, they'd rather just
Mhm.
leave everything to their two daughters and their disabled daughter. They know that their two daughters are going to take care of them. And I've told them why that's a bad idea till I'm blue in the face, but then they still want to go forward with that. So this allows us to not do that. Allows
Yep.
special needs beneficiaries to get more than just the bare minimum from the government. And Liam, that's what you've been sharing, right?
Mhm.
Since it's so little that
Yeah.
they get in SSI. Um, we're able to provide for the special needs beneficiary even during a time when they're incapacitated. We don't have
Mhm.
to rely on siblings to do the right thing. And then we're able to provide for everyone comprehensively. Anything else that you can think of that should be added to this list of benefits when it comes to special needs trust?
Yeah, I'm just going to add something on the asset planning. So, one of the good things that I frequently appreciate is that the special needs trust is creditor proof. So if you have a beneficiary that maybe has trouble controlling impulses and goes out and gets credit cards and runs up credit card debt, it is completely at the discretion of the trustee as to whether or not that gets paid off. And the
Mhm.
creditor cannot invade that special needs trust. So that to me is one of the less spoken about benefits, but I think I see it almost monthly where somebody has, gotten into trouble with some debt, and maybe it just doesn't make sense for the trustee to pay that bill. And they can do it, they can say no and know that the beneficiary is not going to be caused harm by it. Yeah, they'll lose their credit rating, of course,
Mhm.
but maybe that's a good thing because then they won't have 20 credit cards outstanding too.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and then this is the next topic is one that I know is so important and one that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about. But
Yeah.
every time I sit at the table, it feels like with a parent of a child with special needs, one thing that they say is like, I want my son or daughter to be able to stay in the house. And you can sympathize and understand because this is the house where that special needs beneficiary has always lived. This is where they feel comfortable.
Yeah,
They want them to be
absolutely.
independent as possible. But I know from trust administration that it's not always practical and it's so hard. So with housing being this like, giant concern, what are the options where beneficiaries can reside? What are some issues you've seen with housing? What advice do you have for parents when they're doing their estate planning with respect to this issue?
See all the time where there's a family house and it's, say, 4 bedrooms and 2,200 square feet, and the one beneficiary is going to reside there, and there's $100,000 income in the, liquid assets. And the house frequently has deferred maintenance because the parents were living on their Social Security and retirement income, and they were 85 years old. And they just, even if they had the money, they didn't have the wherewithal to get a new roof put on or to get the plumbing redone and so on. So basically, what's dropped in my lap is a trust that has very low liquidity, a house that's paid off and worth a lot. But the reality is the beneficiary cannot afford to live in it,
Mm-hmm.
and cannot afford is the deferred maintenance. Just the utility bills alone sometimes are crippling. They, on a Social Security income that's
Mm-hmm.
now one. It used to be it was two, right? It was the parent and the child. Now it's just down to one.
Right.
So I am really unpopular, but I say it to parents, really consider setting expectations that the house will need to be sold.
Mm-hmm.
I have had special needs trusts where the parents have died and literally I'm left with $2,000 in the bank.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know. And what am I supposed to do? I have to sell the property. So that leaves me literally with, sadly, having to consider almost an eviction of that child. And that's just horrific. I don't want to do that. The child doesn't want it. The child probably doesn't understand the finances to that degree. But the reality is if I don't take care of this, that we're going to have a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I really beg, beg, beg parents to think about, don't. I've literally seen it written in the trust, can't sell the house. Well,
Yeah.
that means the trustee can't use their discretion to figure this out. And I would even suggest that maybe there's some consideration before the parent passes of some alternative arrangements. Might be downsizing the home. It might be that the beneficiary, moves out and goes
Mhm.
someplace else to actually increase the independence. I met with a woman last month. She was so cool. This mom, the child has regional center, and so they are able to get a group home paid for. And mom is now 80, and what she's done is made arrangements for her son to go into the group home, and then on the weekends he resides with her. So it's not like it was cut out cold turkey. He's getting more socialization than he had before.
Mhm.
He had to adjust. Yeah, it wasn't easy in the beginning, but he's
Mhm.
actually thriving in that new environment. And of course, the mom is so proud of what she's done. It wasn't easy for her to do this. I mean, she definitely had to give a dose of tough love. She took advantage of the fact that she had regional center for this child. From what she said, it's a lovely home. Oh, the other thing is she got on a wait list, and it took probably about 4 years before there was an opening. The wait lists
Right.
for good
Yeah.
group homes are long. Yeah,
Right.
they could be 10 or 15 years, but for her, it was about 4 years that she got in. So just think about, just try to, as a parent, try to envision what things are going to look like later on and what steps could possibly be taken. Because just saying he feels comfortable in his home it just may not work.
Exactly. And that client that you were just speaking of, like,
Mhm.
they truly did planning, right? I mean,
Yes,
that
yes,
that isn't
yes.
incredible, because I have so many clients that say to me, well, then they'll just have to be 24-hour care in the home. And it's like, okay, but
Yeah.
you know how expensive that is?
Mhm.
Are there going to be enough funds to do that? Are we going to be
Right.
relying on siblings, other family members who have their own lives and might not be able to commit their entire life to the child the way that you have? But it's
Mhm.
such difficult conversations to have, because again, it's very, very difficult for clients to picture their child's lives without them in it. And it's just a really,
Well,
really
it's a
hard.
terrible reality, right? Because the
Yeah.
reality is nothing we do is going to replace mom and dad.
Yeah.
We just can't do it. It won't be as good,
Hmm.
and that's really hard to accept. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Any other advice that you have for parents with respect to the housing issue?
Don't tell your kid he can live here forever. He or she can live
Yeah.
here forever, because that really missets expectations. And I've heard that said over and over again. And I think if somehow it could be emphasized, this is a place where we live, but it's not our end all and be all. Just that, um, it's not the center of our life. Our home is not the center, or our house is not the center of our life. Our home is the center of our life.
Right. I love that. So, so true. And then we touched on this, but with regards to selecting the trustees, since obviously this is your area of expertise, who can serve as a trustee? What do they need to know? What are some of the benefits of naming a professional? We did touch on this, but when a special needs trust goes into effect, are there certain notices and information that have to be sent over to Social Security and Medi-Cal? Do we have to respond to their questions? I'm so happy that we're doing this, and I'm going to have the recording because I'm going to send it to clients in the future, because I have books and things that I recommend to clients, but obviously asking them to read an entire book could be hard. But in making this decision, whether or not to name a family member or to name a professional, I
Hmm.
just want them to know what goes into it. And
Hmm.
then, they can educate the family member who might serve as trustee, or they can start having conversations with professionals so that they feel more comfortable, and so that they can get their questions answered. But what does a trustee have to do on a special needs trust?
Well, you're right. There are certain notices that go out in the beginning. Those are required by California law. There's potentially some notices to public agencies depending on the type of benefits. Probably the biggest one too is to make sure that they're getting the right public benefit, because that might change when a parent dies.
Mhm.
That's probably the biggest gap I see. People don't do
Mm.
that, and a good trustee is going to know what to look for and to make some suggestions. Family, absolutely, family members can do this, and they might be the best person for it. They just need to be aware that they're going to have to do some work to educate themselves and be absorbed in the process of being the trustee. And if they have a good attorney, then that will help also, is that the attorney can help guide them. But it's definitely not something where you sign a piece of paper and then leave it for 10 years. You
Mhm.
have responsibilities. You have to provide an annual accounting. So that means keeping really good books and records on the expenditures. Various public agencies may ask you to submit documentation about the trust. So you've got to be ready to respond, and usually respond pretty quickly. It makes me so mad. This isn't nice for me to talk about Social Security, but this one just really bugs me. They send out these letters with requests. They don't put a date on it, but they'll give you a deadline, and the deadline will be like in 3 days or something. And
Yes,
if you
I've gotten
don't
that
do it,
too.
yeah, have you gotten that too? It's like, guys, come on.
Yeah.
Um, but at any rate, so you've got to be prepared to respond, because that non-response could be their reason for denying all further payments to the person. So that's really serious stuff.
Hmm.
You have to make sure that you understand the terms of the trust. You're not violating those terms, because if you violate the terms, Social Security could consider it an exempt or a non-exempt resource, meaning, oh, that's going to count as an asset toward that person. And then also you don't have the asset protection aspect either if they do that to you. So benefits of naming a professional trustee. Well, I think you need not just any trustee, professional trustee. I think you need somebody who does this.
Yeah.
So I would caution some, there aren't that many of us that really specialize in this. So when you're interviewing people, find out how many trusts do they manage? Like what percentage of their day is spent doing this? What kind of training do they go on? Well, those kinds of questions you really should be asking, because if this is 10% of their business, it probably is not the best fit, because these things are technically, they're technically difficult. There's a lot to them. And so that person really needs to be pretty immersed in the new rules and things like that. Um, when is it best to start planning? I mean, yesterday, because we could all be run over by a bus tomorrow, and that answer is no different than it is for any estate planning. It's just that now we've got a vulnerable individual on top of it. So it scares me. If I had a magic wand for Orange County and LA County, I would wave it so that parents could. I think usually parents, and I was guilty of this. I didn't have my proper estate plan for many years. It was because I didn't know what to do. I had a
Mhm.
child that had some challenges. And I think sometimes when we don't know what to do or we're scared to face what's going to happen, we
Mhm.
don't do anything. And that really is a potential for disaster. And Alex, I'm sure you've seen that over the years where this inertia, we do nothing. But look at it this way. Let's say you do put the plan together and you're not real happy completely with it, but it's 80% there. That is so much better to do that than to do nothing.
Mhm.
Doing nothing is guaranteeing that there's going to be a crisis. And frankly, you're being kind of selfish because you're gone, but your family's going to have to pick up the pieces for this child, and it's not going to be easy for them. Um, so start planning immediately. Start talking to professionals. The attorney. The attorney really drives everything. That's what I would do is I'd be talking to the attorney, figuring out what my estate plan would look like, how I'm going to weave in the special needs trust and where it is. And then if you decide to use a professional trustee, yeah, call them up and ask them what they do. One of my concerns about professional trustees for this particular area, I mean, these trusts frequently go on 40, 50 years or more. So you need to have a trustee that has a succession plan. Make sure that
Mhm.
that firm is going to stay in business. A lot of trustees are sole proprietorships, and it's possible that by the time you need this or by the time it triggers that they're not in business. So that should be one of your number one questions to them is what happens when you're gone.
Awesome. And
All
we
right.
did get a few questions.
Yeah,
Um, One question was, what is the full term for able? And so, with respect to
yeah,
that, I don't know.
I can look it up. I should know what the E is. A better life. God, I should know that. I
Yeah,
failed my
I should
quiz.
too. I never ever say it though. I always just talk about able accounts, able
Let's
accounts.
see.
So yeah,
Oh my
let's.
God, they don't even have it here on the web. They just have a. Yeah, let me
I might
look.
be able to find
How
it.
able? That's funny. This means we failed our program here.
I
Oh my.
know,
Oh, you
seriously.
know what? They don't do it. Okay. Achieving a better life experience. So
Yes.
the E is for experience.
Yes, and it's the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act of 2014. And
Yeah,
there
exactly.
is a lot of information. I believe that it's calable.gov, but what
Yeah,
I
it
love,
is.
okay,
It
and
is.
there's a really great Q&A page that I actually have printed out for clients before in the past.
Mhm.
A lot of great information on that site. If you have if you want more information about ABLE accounts. Another question, are parents still able to apply for regional center group home while the child is a minor if there's a 10 to 15-year wait?
So let me be clear. That's not a wait for everything. That's only a wait for some programs. And regional center, I've seen them get a group home and a good group home. Like I had one case where the beneficiary was living. So parents had died. Beneficiary was living with a cousin. Cousin died unexpectedly. Um, regional center immediately stepped in and had a place for her within days. So I don't want to give you the impression that it's always very long. it just that there are a few of them out there that are good that just have these really long waits. I would
Mhm.
ask your service coordinator. I don't know the answer to that, but I would definitely ask the service coordinator. But if you're going to go in the wait program, then you need to have identified what program, what home you want, and find out if there's a wait list because they don't all have it. What tends to happen on some of the good ones that have been around a while, if you think about their residents tend to stay there for life. So I have seen, I've seen group homes where some people have lived there over 20 years, 25 years. So there
Wow.
isn't a vacancy that happens until that person themselves dies. Yeah,
Right.
we had an estate one time, a trust estate, that the the decedent actually owned group homes,
Mm.
and he was known to have wonderful group homes. And one of our challenges was actually to keep them open because the license went with him and when he died. So we were able to keep it open because we didn't want to displace people that considered that their home for that many years. I mean, just it would have been horrific. So, but I was really surprised. But then when I thought about it, well, that makes sense. If somebody moved in when they're 30, they could easily live there till they're 60 or 70 or whatever it is. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and if their home only has 6 beds or 8 beds or whatever it is, they may not have that much turnover.
Yeah. Very, very true. Well, thank you so much, Leanne, for your time today. I hope that this has been informative and that it's been clear that it's very important to have a special needs trust for a beneficiary with disability so that we can protect their government benefits, we could provide financial oversight, and just overall enhance their quality of life. That
Hmm.
ultimately is the goal. If you have more questions about special needs trust specifically, I'm going to share some information about my firm on the screen, and then also a link to be able to book a call with us if you have any questions. And then I also am sharing in the chat Leanne's information, so her phone
Yeah,
number,
because
her website.
yeah,
She is
because
a wealth.
Oscar's asking for information. So Oscar, feel free to just send me an email, and I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, absolutely. So her website is hitchmanfiduciaries.com and her phone number is there, which hopefully I got it right, Leanne,
You did?
949-200-9712. And so as you can see, Leanne is incredible and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you for sharing your experience, your stories, and just helping to educate others about special needs planning. I really, really appreciate it, truly.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex.
No problem. Well, everyone have a wonderful day and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.